when was it in history that people started to call themselves Palestinians? Was it in the wake of the establishment of the PLO in 1964, as many pro-Israel propagandists would have you believe? The answer is no. It was not in the wake of the establishment of the PLO in the 1960s. Right? Israel was part of my American Jewish upbringing. Right? It was, I was sent to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. I got a chance to experience what life was like in Israel already in high school when I was very young and impressionable. You had Americans who knew nothing about Israel or Palestine, who were totally uninterested in Israel and Palestine before October 7th, all of a sudden putting up Israeli flags on their social media profiles. And yet Joe Biden is now basically going around Congress and saying, to hell with what the elected representatives of the American people think. I'm just gonna fund Israel directly, especially when you consider that over the past 2 months, Israel has killed more children in Gaza than Russia has killed in Ukraine in 2 years.
Before going in, what we are going to discuss in this podcast, I would just like to know a little bit more for my audience about Zach Foster.
First of all, Faisal, thanks so much for having me on. I am an American. I grew up in Detroit, going to Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps and Jewish youth groups, and got interested in Israel. And I was curious and open-minded. And so because of my interest in Israel, I also got interested in Palestine, it being the same place, but it also being the name used by the Palestinians rather than the Israelis and the Jews. And one thing led to the next, and I did a Ph.D. in Palestinian history. I write a lot about Israel-Palestine. I have a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox, where I try to unpack research on Palestine, Palestinian politics, and Palestinian history, and generally speaking, trying to make the academic research on Palestine more accessible to broader audiences.
So you did your PhD on Palestine, right? And
That's
from
correct.
Princeton University. How did you feel that you should do your PhD? Like what was that got you interested into Palestine?
Well, I grew up hearing all of these stories about Israel and the Palestinians. And one of the stories that I grew up hearing over and over again was that the Palestinians, quote unquote, never called themselves Palestinians. This was a famous quote by Golda Meir from the 1970s. And it gets repeated and regurgitated all the time in Jewish circles, in pro-Israel Zionist circles in the United States. And so I got super interested in the history of the Palestinian people, as Palestinians. And so I asked myself, when was it in history that people started to call themselves Palestinians? Was it in the wake of the establishment of the PLO in 1964, as many pro-Israel propagandists would have you believe? The answer is no. It was not in the wake of the establishment of the PLO in the 1960s. It was not even in the wake of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, nor was it after the establishment of the British Mandate in 1920. A Palestinian identity dates to the 19th century. You have many foreigners, Americans, British, German, Russians using that word Palestinian already in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. And then you have many Arabs in Palestine using that word already in the late 19th century, and then in 1901 and the first decade and a half of the. So that's what I ended up writing my PhD dissertation on, was trying to understand how the Arabs of Palestine started to call themselves Palestinians, and more generally, like how the word of Palestine in Arabic, how that word evolved in history, who used that word in history, during which time periods, and in which contexts, and for what purposes. And that was really the focus of my dissertation research.
Okay, perfect. So, like growing up in a Jewish family, right? How was that?
Well, look, I can only speak to my own experiences, although I think they're somewhat reflective of many American Jews. My, at home we celebrated Shabbat dinner every week. We celebrated the Jewish holidays. We celebrated Israel's Independence Day for the same reason we celebrated Purim and Hanukkah and Passover. It was as much a part of the Jewish calendar as the Jewish holidays themselves, right? Israel was part of my American Jewish upbringing, right? It was, you know, I was sent to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. I got a chance to experience what life was like in Israel already in high school when I was very young and impressionable. And then in college, the same. I had many free trips to Israel paid for by different Jewish organizations, Hasbara fellowships, jammed the Orthodox organizations on my campus were also sponsoring free trips to Israel. Other organizations, multiple, are talking about 3-4 different organizations sent me to Israel for free in college. So look, I got interested in Israel, and at some point I was curious and open minded, and that led me to grow more and more interested in the Palestinians. And like I said, one thing led to the next, and I ended up learning Arabic and pursuing a PhD in with my focus on the origins of a Palestinian identity in the late Ottoman period.
Okay, all right. I wouldn't like you to go into the history of this conflict. Basically, we would just like to explore a few new things that are evolving with this conflict. That is, like, it. This conflict is not new. It started since 1940s. So, how do you see the perception of Americans right now? Like, what I have read, what I have heard, that in the American, uh, in American population, this narrative that Israel has the right to defend itself is changing with this conflict, with this much casualties in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, especially. So, do you see any change in the narrative?
Yes, absolutely. I see a huge a sea change in public opinion towards Israel and Palestine. Look, it's important to remember that in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th heinous attacks against Israeli civilians, there was an outpouring of support for Israel for the first time in certainly in recent memory. You had Americans who knew nothing about Israel or Palestine, who were totally uninterested in Israel and Palestine before October 7th, all of a sudden putting up Israeli flags on their social media profiles, calling
Hmm.
out Hamas for the heinous attacks and standing in solidarity with the people of Israel. And that was in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. And so, it didn't have to turn out this way. But what happened very quickly, almost immediately after the attacks, Israel began its aerial bombardment of the Gaza Strip and started to carpet bomb 2.3 million people. And already in the days following, the public opinion started to shift. Within a week or two, you would say that you could say that that outpouring of support for Israel was all but gone, and instead, you saw an outpouring of support for the Palestinians. The Palestinian people of Gaza, who not only had faced 16 years of blockade and siege leading up to October 7th, but then since October 7th, we're now facing a total blockade and a total siege. After which, Yoav Gallant, Israeli defense minister, likened the Palestinians of Gaza to human animals, calling for a total cutting off of water, food, and electricity and fuel. Shortly thereafter, within a few weeks, you had Israeli prime minister say, liken the Palestinians in Gaza to Amalek, the biblical peoples that were at war with the Israelites, whom God ordered to erase and wipe out and eradicate every man, every woman, every child, and every ox. The biblical peoples of Israel were ordered to wipe out, to commit a genocide against the people of Amalek. And that is what Bibi Netanyahu, that is how Bibi Netanyahu, current Israeli prime minister, described the enemy. He issued an order to his soldiers to carry out a genocide. Okay. And so obviously public opinion has shifted dramatically, so much so that a vast majority of the American public, we're talking 80% of Americans now, have been calling for a ceasefire for weeks at a time when the American government is sending military aid on the order of billions of dollars a year to Israel. on the order of $15 billion of in extra military aid just in the past few weeks. You had the U.S. Congress now at odds with President Joe Biden, who just in the past few days has basically subverted the U.S. Congress, because it's the U.S. Congress that should be making these, aid packages, right? It's the United States Congress that funds the United States government, funds United States programs overseas, including military aid programs overseas. And yet Joe Biden is now basically going around Congress and saying, to hell with what the elected representatives of the American people think. I'm just gonna fund Israel directly. And so you're seeing a rift now, both within the Democratic Party, both between President Biden and Democratic senators and congresspeople, as well as between the political establishment more generally and the American public, who have no desire for another forever war, who have no desire to be funding a military carrying out what Israeli scholar Raz Siegel calls a textbook case of genocide. The American people have no desire for that. And so you're seeing a huge outpouring of support for the Palestinian people. Some of the largest protests for Palestine have taken place in the past 2 months. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people descending to Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago in early November. You saw Jewish a Voice for Peace take over the Statue of Liberty. You saw a Jewish Voice for Peace take over train stations in New York and elsewhere. So you're seeing huge outpouring of support for the Palestinian people more generally. And to your question, yes, we are seeing a huge sea change in public opinion. And for the first time, I would say, I think that we can expect to see a real change in American official political opinion as a result of this war. I think that the American public has now firmly come to the realization that what Israel is doing is unacceptable and that it needs to end immediately.
But in the world, when it has been seen that the Jewish lobby in the America, in United States of America, is so strong and so powerful that they can influence the government. They have the role in making and breaking the governments of the United States. Though we see this shift in the public opinion, do you think that that much strong the Jewish lobby would be able to reverse this public opinion with whatever means they have?
So first of all, I wouldn't characterize the lobby that is supporting Israel as a Jewish lobby. In fact, the largest part of the lobby is actually evangelical Christians. Recall that the Republican base, the Republican Party that currently controls the U.S. Congress, their base is primarily, I would say, evangelical Christians. And evangelical Christians are some of the most supportive of the state of Israel of all Americans, including Jewish Americans. So that's the first point I would make. Also, I would say that even within the Jewish section of the lobby, I would really call it the Israel lobby because they have a strong, support for
Zionist
Israel.
lobby, we can say Zionist lobby.
Sure, you could say Zionist lobby. I think that's a fair characterization. But then also recall that it's not just AIPAC, the Zionist lobby, that is supporting Israel and is threatening anyone who criticizes Israel with deplatformatization. Recall that it was I forget exactly who this was, but there was a state senator or state politician. I believe it was in Michigan, who was offered $30 million by AIPAC to run against Rashida Tlaib in the Democratic primary for her congressional seat this coming November. So the lobby is working very, very hard in trying to remove anyone from office who is supporting the Palestinian people and calling out, opposing Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. And then the final thing I would say is that it's not just the evangelical lobby and it's not just the pro-Israel AIPAC lobby. It's also, you could say, the Zionist left lobby of J Street has also been basically, supporting Israel and criticizing politicians who are not supporting Israel during this genocidal war. But in addition to all of those lobbies, you also have the weapons lobby. We're talking a lobby, weapons manufacturers that absolutely love these multi-billion-dollar military aid packages to Israel, because they're the ones that benefit very
Yeah.
directly. Lockheed Martin,
True.
Caterpillar, right?
True.
These companies benefit tremendously from these military aid packages, because there are stipulations in these aid packages that Israel has to spend the money in the United States. You spend the money buying weapons from American military weapons manufacturers. So, it's a deep lobby that, in part and parcel, I would say, by the way, is also part of the American political system more generally, and it's a problem, I think, that runs much deeper than the Israel lobby or the weapons manufacturing lobby or the evangelical lobby. It's a fundamental flaw in American democracy that these lobbies, that's again all lobbies, right, have so much power and so much influence as a result of I would say going all the way back for decades ago, when you basically have an American law that allows a U.S. law that allows anyone to establish an organization and funnel as much money as they want into that organization to run political ads against whoever they want, to run political ads supporting whatever policies they want. American politics is dominated by money, and unfortunately that manifests itself not just in Israel's in the United States' support for Israel, but in many other in many other fields and political issues. So this is a bigger American problem, I would say.
Okay, Zach, you are very much active on Twitter, so you have you are from that generation that is very much active on Twitter, and they use these platforms to you know to uncover those myths that have been created over the period of time. So, how do you think that this social media, especially Twitter, now X, and the Facebook, but generally the X have been playing this role that where the information was not being censored, the videos were being played, though they can be doctored or whatsoever, being done by the Israel or by the supporters of the Palestine. So personally, how much do you see that this have helped common people to understand the issue?
Look, I would say most people in the world do not use Twitter or X. Facebook and Instagram and TikTok are much bigger platforms that have much bigger user bases. Um, X is popular among journalists, is popular among media professionals and politicians and other yeah, famous personalities, media personalities. But I would say your average American or Canadian or Mexican or German or French or British or Pakistani person is not accessing Twitter. It has a user base, I believe, a monthly active user base in the hundreds of millions, whereas a Facebook or an Instagram or a TikTok has an active user base in the billions. An order of magnitude larger.
True.
So look, I would say X is great, in part because I think it is empowering, for an average person to raise their voice and speak out. I think X is great for kind of punchy takes. For you don't have to work through a media organization to get your voice heard. If I want to submit an article to the Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post or Time Magazine, there are layers and layers of editorial bureaucracy that are determining what gets airtime and what doesn't. Okay, I mean, just to give you an example, I was asked by one editor at Time Magazine to write a piece for the magazine, and I produced a piece and got some feedback on it, sent it back. They had another editor come in and basically delete half of the article and remove all of these really interesting anecdotes that I think are important to make my case, to make my argument, which is in this particular case that it was Israeli violence that radicalized Hamas in the first Intifada and beyond. But basically, you have these editors going in and removing all kinds of facts and pieces of evidence that support my argument. You have an editor basically undercutting the argument and basically wanting to publish something without the evidence. And this is Time Magazine. And I've had this is not the first time I've had to deal with this. I think this is very common, that you have these editorial boards that are mostly, boomers who were raised, grew up in the 1970s and 80s, a completely different world, who are basically have this view of Israel that Israel can do no wrong and no harm. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. There's no, quote unquote, no moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel. So you have these boomer editors who are totally disconnected from the reality. And that's what you have to deal with through the mainstream media. And so I think X is great, and all of these other platforms are great for empowering individuals. Of course, the risk is that, there are a lot of risks. I would say number one, having a filter is a problem because it prevents some voices from being heard. But also, you need some amount of filter because otherwise, you get people spreading misinformation and propaganda, which is not helpful either. The other
Yeah.
problem, the final thing I would say about these social platforms in general is that enragement equals engagement, and engagement equals Nissan ads, which equals dollars and cents for these big media platforms. And so the result is that the most outrageous, enraging content, it gets likes and it gets clicks and it gets retweets and it gets shared. Whereas the more nuanced
Exactly.
content, the more analytical content does not get likes, it does not get shares. And so I would say the most important content gets the least visibility, which is a big problem on these platforms as well, as I'm sure you all know.
Yes, true. So let's move ahead. And one thing during this conflict, one word I would say that have been heard, the hypocrisy of the West, especially if we see, those who have been, vocal for the Palestinian rights. They have been saying that, when it comes to Ukraine, they raise their voice, they give them the funding, they in the UN, they place sanctions on the Russians. So this is what have been heard. And when it comes to Palestinians, similarly in Pakistan, when it comes to Kashmir, no one raises the voice because India is there to outcompete China for the United States. So this West hypocrisy word that was being used by the common people as well in Pakistan and East, and for those who have been raising voice for the Palestine, this was commonly heard. So when you see that this is what they portray, that we are for the peace, we are for the liberal values, and this is this is how the world will progress. The UN organization comes in, the UN would resolve most of the problems, but in reality this is what we have been seeing. So do you think that this rules based order that was being uh, they used to brag, the West used to brag for that, that they have this order while the developing countries don't have, and they have given the majority this right to violate the laws, the international laws, even if the country, if even if I am a strong, we have a stronger state, then we can do whatever we want. So through this conflict, this has been constantly being reflected. How do you see? I hope you got my point.
I think you're absolutely correct that the double standard that we are all witnessing is absolutely despicable. Russia invades its neighbor, Ukraine, um, and the whole world rallies behind Ukraine. I mean, not the whole world. I would say Western Europe and the United States rally behind Ukraine, impose sanctions on Russia. The most severe sanctions we've seen in recent memory ever imposed on any government. They freeze the assets, hundreds of billions of dollars in the state treasury, in the central bank, were frozen. I mean, the United States is weaponizing the dollar to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and its illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory and the slaughtering of Ukrainian civilians. Then, 2 years later, Israel does the same thing. It, illegally invades its neighbor, has been occupying its neighbor for 56 years. And what does the United States do? It supports Israel. It supports the occupier and the invader. It's a tremendous double standard, especially when you consider that over the past 2 months, Israel has killed more children in Gaza than Russia has killed in Ukraine in 2 years. The violence is at an order of magnitude more deadly. And yet Israel and the United States is supporting the country, doing the occupying and doing the killing and doing the invading and doing the mass murder. It's totally despicable. And what it suggests is that we do not live in a rules-based international order. We live in a national order in which might makes right, and in which the United States decides who has a just cause and who does not based on some international humanitarian law, not based on some international legal framework, but based on its own imperial interests, based on its own geopolitical interests, based on its own military interests, not based on some kind of rule-based order or some kind of international humanitarian law, all of which suggests very clearly that what Israel is doing in Gaza is it amounts to war crimes and amounts to very severe war crimes, potentially also genocide. And so we've had many international legal scholars. There was a UN about a dozen or 2 dozen legal experts, United Nations legal experts who have PhDs in international law, who are international legal scholars, that have basically said, look, what is happening in Gaza? We are at a real risk of genocide. And the whole reason you issue warnings declaring there's a risk of genocide is to prevent the genocide from happening, which means we need an immediate ceasefire. And yet the United States government is one of the only countries in the world vetoing the ceasefire resolution at the United Nations. It's the impact that this will have on American moral standing in the world will reverberate for decades to come. Every single time the American government lectures China for its treatment of the Uyghurs, lectures India for its treatment of Muslims, lectures Mexico for its brutal violence against the gangs, lectures Argentina, lectures Brazil for destroying the indigenous communities in the Amazon. Anytime the United States wants to pretend like it has any kind of moral legitimacy in the world, it will be reminded over and over again for decades to come that what the United States did in Gaza was supporting a government carrying out a genocidal war. Who are you to be criticizing us when you were complicit in a genocide? And we're going to face that criticism not for the next few weeks or months or years, but for decades.
So, Zach, how do you see this conflict moving forward? Like, how soon are there chances of resolution of this conflict? Are the Gaza Strip, whole of the Strip, would be wiped out?
As far as excuse me, as far as solutions go, I think we're a long ways away from a solution. I think the solution that we need right now is a ceasefire, because there are about half of Palestinians in the north of Gaza are starving to death. Let me repeat that for your listeners. 50% of the population of north of Gaza, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, trapped, encircled by the Israeli military, no access to food, going days on end without food, starving to death. So before we talk about solutions, long-term solutions, we needed a ceasefire immediately to prevent a genocide from happening in real time, live on Instagram. So that's kind of step one. I think at some point, once the violence ends, not just in Gaza, by the way, but also in the West Bank, over the past 2 months, Israel has killed 300 Palestinians in the West Bank and has uprooted more than 1,000 Palestinians from their homes in campaigns of ethnic cleansing. So once the violence comes to an end in Gaza and in the West Bank, and also inside Israel, by the way, where you have hundreds of Palestinians who've been fired from their jobs, hundreds of Palestinians who have been suspended from their studies at university for liking social media posts in solidarity with Gaza. So all of that needs to end. But I think once the violence ends and the oppression ends, we need eventually to return to the negotiating table, in which the Palestinians have an equal seat at the table, right? And that is critical, because if we go back to the old Oslo framework of Israel on the one hand, together with the United States, allied with Israel, supporting Israel, colluding with Israel together on the one hand, and then the Palestinians on the other, a stateless people with no power, with no military. On the other hand, we're going to return to a framework that led us to where we are today, which was a framework in which there's no chance you're ever going to come to a political resolution of this conflict when you have the most powerful state in the Middle East on the one hand, with the most powerful military in the Middle East on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a powerless people with no military, with no leverage in the negotiations. And what resulted from this total power imbalance was Camp David, which failed, and Taba, which failed, and the Ulmer peace plans, which failed, because you cannot arrive in an agreement in which one side has all the power and gets to make all the decisions and get to interpret how the Oslo Accords are enforced, and has no ability to interpret the accords and has no ability to apply any leverage over Israel at all. And so that is a failed framework. What we need instead is a framework where Palestinians and Israelis have equal seats at the table. And the only way you're going to get that kind of framework is one in which a neutral third party applies pressure on Israel to afford the Palestinians an equal seat at the table. And then ultimately, I think that's the only real solution here. And so ultimately, I think what it comes down to is, do the American people elect a president in 2024, because Biden is useless. Biden is an Israeli puppet. What we need is an American president who applies real pressure on Israel to allow the Palestinians an equal seat at the negotiating table. And not just the Palestinian Authority, but all Palestinian groups. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Lion's Den, Jenin Brigade, they all need to be invited, as do the civil society groups, as do Palestinian representatives in exile. You need a comprehensive framework that includes all parties, all stakeholders, right? Because as soon as you go to a negotiating table and you leave out some of the stakeholders, they're going to do what they did in the Oslo period, which was spoil the process, which is carry out violent acts because they were left out. So you need a process that is all Palestinians are at the table and they have an equal seat at the table. And then you need an enforcer to make sure that the negotiations take place in a framework in which both sides have equal seats at the table. Ultimately, I think that is what is needed. Eventually, once we reach a ceasefire and a cessation in hostilities in the short term, that, in my view, is a long-term vision. And then those parties can decide whether they want one state, or whether they want two states, or whether they want three states, and that's up to them to decide. But ultimately, I do think that the only solution to this conflict is a political solution, and one in which all Palestinian groups have an equal seat at the table alongside Israel.
Okay, Zach, this would be hopefully our last question. I just wanted to ask: has there been any of your family members who were, who were the survivors of the Holocaust?
Yeah, my my grandfather, and I mean, you might even say my grandmother on my mother's side, but my grandfather was born in Poland. Every member of his family, his parents, all his brothers and sisters, they were all killed by the Nazis in Poland during World War II. He fled. He escaped shortly before the Polish police entered his home and slaughtered his entire family. He escaped to Russia, to the Soviet Union. Got on a train, got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, wound up in Beijing, wound up in China, in Shanghai, in the ghetto, in the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai for 5 years, and then eventually made his way to South America, and then eventually wound up in Michigan, where I was born and raised.
So actually, I was asking this question because I wanted to relate it to the ones, those who, I'm sure most of the, in Israel, most of the families are the children of Jewish survivors, and their grandparents have seen those, horrors of the Holocaust. And now what we are seeing, the same, they are not doing it, their government is doing it, but they have actually elected that government, and they are doing same to the Palestinians. So don't you think, if we see it in emotional way, the state cannot be emotional, but if we see it, if individuals see it in an emotional way, so don't you think that that is something, horror, that is the horror for them too, and they must stop their government to do so?
Look, I think violence breeds violence. Occupation breeds violence. Siege breeds violence. Home demolitions breeds violence. When you carry out a 16-year-long siege and blockade and a 56-year-long military occupation and a 75-year-long policy of displacement and ethnic cleansing, then you're going to get violence in response. And it doesn't matter how much your group has suffered in history. You know, if you carry out acts of violence against another group, they will retaliate, and that's universal. Unfortunately, I think that the memory of the Holocaust for Jews is still very fresh. And so what it leads Jews to believe is that we are under this constant threat of violence, of anti-Semitism. You know, they hate us for who we are. They hate us because we're Jews. And Jews have that memory, and that's real, and that's real trauma carried through from generation to generation. And it manifests itself in describing the Palestinians as Nazis. I mean, you have the denazification of Gaza, right? That is something you're hearing being said now, likening the Hamas to the Nazis. You know, this is commonplace in Israeli media. If you read Hebrew media or watch Israeli TV, you'll hear Palestinians being compared to Nazis all the time. And so it's this kind of generational trauma that Jews can't seem to kind of like shed themselves of. I think that the thing I would say in response is that if you believe, if you believe that Jews should be able to live in safety and security, as all people should believe, then why is it that you're carrying out these atrocious acts of violence, which you know are going to lead Palestinians to violence? We know this. The Israeli military concluded decades ago that its policies of demolishing the homes of Palestinian militants was counterproductive. They came to that own conclusion on their own. Why was it counterproductive? Because, a Palestinian carries out a gruesome act of violence against Israeli civilians, a suicide bombing. That Palestinian's dead. They go to the home of that Palestinian. They go to his mom's home and his dad's home, and they demolish the home of the parents. Then what happens? What happens after that? The other siblings pick up arms and want to carry out attacks against Israel because of that retribution. And that's happening, and that happens over and over and over again in Israeli history. By the way, one of the co-founders of Hamas, Abdulaziz Rantisi, he was an 8-year-old boy in Gaza, in Khan Yunis, when the Israeli military entered the Khan Yunis camp in November 3rd, 1956. They went door to door. They grabbed every Palestinian male above the age of 15. They lined up all of the Palestinian men above the age of 15 on November 3rd, 1956, and slaughtered them. And guess what happened 2 decades later? That 8-year-old boy, Abdulaziz Rantisi, he co-founded Hamas, the organization that carried out the attacks on October 7th. And so we know what's going to happen. I can tell you with certainty that the amount of atrocious violence Israel has committed in the past 2 months will certainly lead to an intensification of the violence, will lead more Palestinians to pick up more arms in the future. We've seen this over and over and over again. And so if Israelis really do want to live in peace and security, what the hell are you doing? What, you think this is in your interest? You think Palestinians are going to say, "Oh wow, now that you've killed 20,000 of us, we've learned our lesson. We'll just peacefully go quietly into the night, as a sheep to the slaughterhouse." You think that's going to be the attitude among Palestinians? What are you, fucking batshit insane? Do you have any memory at all of Israeli violence and the response that Palestinians have had to that violence in the past? It's mind blowing that Israelis think this is somehow in their interests, that they're somehow defending themselves by carrying out these atrocious acts of violence. It's ultimately, it's only going to cause more harm to Israelis themselves in the months and the years and the decades to come.
All right. Thank you so much, Zach, for your time. Your insights were wonderful. Hopefully, this would reach to our audience and hopefully to the policymakers in United States and Israel.